It's time now to turn away from purely philosophical concerns and move gradually and carefully towards science. And to do that, we're going to unfold a very brief overview of the history of psychology, which is quite distinct from the history of the philosophy of mind, which has been our concern. Fields interact. Philosophers don't remain ignorant of developments in psychology, and psychologists ought at least to be aware of the substantive issues in the philosophy of mind. But when we turn to psychology, we're turning to a very, very large and disparate field. Naming our fields in science is problematic because it sets up boundaries that we might not want. So the term psychology applies to a vast field which has very many aspects. Some parts of the field of psychology are concerned with employing the scientific method and doing something we might call science. Others are not. Others have more to do with taking care of each other, providing counseling, care, as solace for those who are in distress in some way. The borders between those two activities, taking care of people and trying to do science, is not clear. This is certainly not as clear, for example, as it is when we take care of the body and we develop medicine in accordance with scientific principles. We're still helping the person there, but because we know what a body is and where it is, the scientific method has more purchase. It's easier. So we shouldn't assume that psychology is any one single field. We should recognize that it arises out of our concern for each other and ourselves, of course, trying to understand not only who and what we are, but also how we might be, how we could be, how we should be, and how we can help. The term psychology is very old. It's an old Greek root, psyche, but it was first coined as the name of a field of study in 1590, but it didn't develop as a field of scientific endeavor until the end of the 19th century. It was at that stage in 1879 that the first experimental laboratory devoted to psychology was set up. It was set up in Germany, in Leipzig, by Wilhelm Wundt. And around the same time, William James in America published the first textbook in the field, which was called Principles of Psychology, a very large and rich resource. At the time, all psychologists seem to have been bearded men. That's not entirely necessary anymore. So where are we when we get to this stage in the 19th century? Well, it's kind of difficult for us to bear history in mind all the time. This is, after all, not so terribly long ago. It's so recent that my grandfather was alive before the Principles of Psychology was published. And yet, the science of psychology could not emerge prior to this because science had not separated itself from theology. And it required the revolution of Darwin and the theory of evolution to make it very clear that we are of the natural order. We are not supernatural sort. We are simultaneously people, humans, organisms, animals. We belong in the order of nature, and with that we can be studied as one might study any animal, organism, species. Prior to about 1850, to view the person in this way was considered heretical and could get you in an awful lot of trouble. It's no accident that the book Frankenstein was written at the start of the 19th century by Mary Shelley in exile. The ideas in the novel Frankenstein were drawn from a gaining sense that science was going to be able to speak to the study of minds, that the electricity, which was a fairly recent invention, was relevant somehow to the movement of bodies, and that we could think about humans from the point of view, from what looked like a godlike point of view, to understand how they worked. Mary Shelley couldn't have written that in England at the time. She had to be abroad. By the end of the 19th century, however, science has made enormous advances, and there's been lots of technological spin-offs: physics, chemistry, electromagnetism, evolution, tons and tons of science going on, which has greatly and profoundly affected people's lives. So these are not abstract insights. Rather, some of the fruits of scientific work are now changing people's lives through the Industrial Revolution, changing the social fabric, changing the way people live, supporting the move from the countryside into cities. And science is on a roll, and it seems that the scientific method, or the scientific way of asking about something, can be done to anything. So it seems obvious that with this newfound freedom to investigate ourselves, a science is going to be born. So let's have a look at one of these characters, William James. He was an American, lived in Boston, from a very distinguished family. His brother Henry James was a famous novelist, what we might call a modernist novelist now. And William James had a specific focus, which was on the nature of consciousness or experience. And those words are themselves a little bit unstable, but we'll just go with it for the moment. And the way that he wrote about this has gone into the language. We speak these days of a stream of consciousness, as if you were writing without thinking about it. We say that stream of consciousness stuff. That phrase comes from William James, from this passage where he says, consciousness doesn't appear to itself chopped up in bits, it flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought, of consciousness, or subjective life. And so this notion of the stream of consciousness was, for William James, the ultimate fact for psychology. This was what psychology should shed some light on. It hasn't been a simple task. We're not there yet. And the idea of the stream of consciousness didn't prove to be terribly useful from a scientific point of view, but it did stir the imagination. In a way, we know what he's talking about. And that idea infiltrated literature far more than science. So not just his brother Henry James, but you'll find this way of thinking about an inner life in all the novels of the time, in Dostoevsky, in James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. This gave rise to a particular way of describing personal experience, where the writer seems to be inside the head of the character. Novels written before this time don't have that quality of putting you inside the head of a character, and from the end of the 19th century, they most certainly do. So William James is taking one particular approach here, and he's taking consciousness as his ultimate fact for psychology. As well as his psychological textbook, he had written a very important work called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he was not interested at all in what we might call world religions, institutions, churches. He wanted to know sort of what is it like to be someone very different from himself. And he was influenced and knew a good deal about some Indian philosophy, Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, as well as Western science. And these traditions have very well developed vocabularies and sets of concepts for thinking about consciousness. To this day, we draw very, very heavily from such ideas in some areas of cognitive science. He took an interesting tack with respect to the philosophical differences that we've outlined already. You've seen what a what a dangerous field this is, how difficult it is to articulate any strong views about mind without ending up looking foolish or tying yourself up in metaphysical knots. William James was one of a trio of philosophers, the others being Charles Sanders Peirce and John Dewey, who were known as the American pragmatists, which means they didn't try to make the ultimate statements about reality. When they tackled a problem, they wanted to see, well, can I understand this in a way that's of some use to me? Not can I get at its essence, can I find out its these kinds of philosophical goals, but rather, can I come up with a useful theory that will allow me to gain some mastery over the world or myself in some way? This is very helpful in avoiding some of the pitfalls, philosophical pitfalls we've mentioned. And interestingly, it's also the origin of another sort of current within psychology, which is the notion of self-help. The bookshelves are full of self-help manuals telling you how to be successful, lose weight, get ahead, be happy, and so on. None of them scientific in any respect, but also all part of psychology. So we've got this counseling, care, taking care of each other, pastoral role for psychology. We've got this scientific investigation of consciousness, and as we'll see, also of behavior, which is very different, and the self-help tradition. So psychology is very, very widespread. Now, I mentioned that William James had written the first textbook in 1890, and Wilhelm Wundt had set up the experimental laboratory in Germany in 1879. Wilhelm Wundt was exploring a rather different way of thinking about scientific psychology. He was interested in behavior, and he was interested in the link between what we can measure and what seems to be not measurable, but nonetheless real. So the mental, if you like. Now, it's not clear how you go about studying this. It was very puzzling to try and establish a science of psychology. Nobody knew what the right answer was. The textbooks hadn't been written, the methods hadn't been devised. It wasn't even clear what a mind was or what. If William James says the ultimate fact for psychology is consciousness, the stream of consciousness, we don't know how to define that either. So how do you do this? Well, the answer is lots and lots of approaches were tried. People set out with very, very many different agendas, trying to illuminate both behavior and experience in different ways. One way that they did this was, of course, through philosophical argumentation, through the application of reason, analysis, a lot of armchair work. That had been going on for a long time. What was new then was introducing things like the experimental method. So we got behavioral experiments, where the experimenter asks people to behave in one way or another. As we've seen, the word behavior has this property that a behavior is not independent of the observer. So supposing I'm a scientist and I decide to study the behavior of I make up some behavior, a task. I come up with some artificial task, and I get people to do this. I can now measure their performance on the task as I've set it. But it might be a task that would never have occurred to them. This might be not some activity that they ordinarily engage with. Hence of the behavior is tied to my design of the behavior. Or if we're observing people in the wilds, to my interpretation of their continuous activity as serving one goal or another. Now, in this way, there's unlimited scope for inventing experiments. One popular field at the time was hypnosis, of all things, still actually of interest to psychologists. At that time, it had a very dodgy reputation. It went by the name of mesmerism, and was very popular at parties and things like this. We're going to look at one of these many avenues that was explored, called psychophysics. This is sort of one of the kind of approaches that people like Wilhelm Wundt set out to approach. And the name is a bit weird, isn't it? Psychophysics. Psycho suggesting mental, abstract, physics suggesting both tangible and measurable. We've seen that these words are not simple. And I'd like to get you a flavor of what psychophysics is, because very many of these initial approaches to studying experience and behavior did not pan out. We'll see that the discipline, the scientific end of psychology, has been changing and changing and changing, has never settled down. But psychophysics was one of the first currents, and it's still very current. It's about the only empirical, scientifically oriented branch of psychology that has a continuous history going back to the 19th century. So it's important to understand what that is. And the last thing there, introspection or looking within, we'll get to later. For now, let's have a look at this rum business of psychophysics. So there's two terms here. There's the psycho and the physics. Now, physics suggests that we know what we're doing, that we can measure things. And so there's lots of properties of, for example, sound and light that we know how to measure. We know how to measure brightness. We know how to measure the intensity, the frequency of things. We've got good physics there. Sounds and patterns of light are also perceived. So we hear sounds and we see images or lights or whatever is put in front of our eyes. But the way in which it sounds, comes from experience. The only way to find out what you hear is to ask you. No machine can do the hearing for you. No machine can do the seeing for you. So that's the psycho bit. It's assumed that the sound as it appears to you is something which is entirely unique and only obtainable by asking you about it. Now, asking someone a question is a weird way to measure something. That's the psycho end of things. So, put it formally, we know how to measure the physical properties of things like sounds and light. But we don't necessarily know how those physical properties relate to the way they are experienced or perceived. We're going to take an example from the domain of sound. And we know how to measure the frequency of a sound. That, in physical terms, means counting vibrations per second in the air or in a membrane. We have a very good grasp of this. We can count it in cycles per second, which is a unit known as hertz, Hz here. Frequencies are heard as different pitches. That is, some sounds sound low to you, some sounds sound high to you. But it's not clear what the relationship between the perception and the measurement is. So let's do a little example. I hope this transfers well to a recording situation. Here's a sound generated at 100 cycles per second. Rather ugly sound. Now, you heard that, and you're going to hear a sound now at 200 cycles per second, and I want you to compare what you just heard with that. It was higher. It was definitely higher. Those of you who are musicians will have recognized that it was an octave higher, equivalent to going from a low C to a high C on the piano, as it were. So it seems an octave. We understand an octave in perceptual terms. A note seems to recur in a higher register, and we call that an octave. This has fascinated mathematicians and philosophers for donkey's years. What if we go up to 300 hertz? Will we be an octave higher again? The answer is no, but at 400 hertz, that's an octave higher again. So the distance from 100 to 200 is perceived as equivalent to the distance from 200 to 400. And we can do this every time we double the frequency, we seem to go up an octave again. So here's 800. So that an even distance along a frequency scale does not correspond to an even distance in a perceptual sense. We need to double the frequency in order to move the same distance, one octave, in perceptual sense. And in this way, we can try to uncover the regularities between the thing we can measure, shown here on the x-axis, the frequency, and the thing that we hear, shown here on the y-axis, which is the reported pitch. Now, we measure frequency in cycles per second. We need a different unit to measure equal perceptual steps. The unit in this case is called the mel. It's on a mel scale, and the plot there shows you the relationship that psychophysicists have uncovered about the relationship between frequency as measured and pitch as heard. The only way to find out what you hear is to ask you. So psychophysics develops lots of methods that do things like play you two sounds and see, can you tell the difference between them? Maybe one is 100 hertz and one is 101 hertz. Can you spot that? In this way, we can look for your sensitivity. We can map out your sensitivity at different ranges, for example, of frequency. So this notice of a just noticeable difference has played a big role. Or we can give you knobs and give you two different sounds and ask you to adjust them until they sound equal to you. Or give you three sounds and ask you to adjust the middle one until the interval between each pair of sounds sounds the same. This is a peculiar business, but it has a very robust set of methods, and it can be applied quite widely. So we just explored the relationship between frequency, which is a measured physical property, and pitch, which is a perceptual property. Staying in the domain of sound, we could have varied the amplitude, which is the amount of energy, and looked at how the corresponding subjective loudness of the sound is. So loudness is something that you perceive. Amplitude is something that we can measure. We have no instruments for measuring pitch or loudness. We have instruments for measuring frequency and amplitude, and psychophysics tries to establish the relationships between them. Most of this work has not been done on sound, but on vision. And one such property, for example, that we can measure is luminosity, which refers to the amount of photons emitted by a light source. And that corresponds with a perceptual property, which is brightness. Nobody can measure brightness. Brightness is a subjective property which we ask people about. Sound and vision have occupied most of the work here, but you can do this with very complex stimuli in very complex domains. So, for example, we could measure all the chemicals in a fine French wine. We have good instruments for analyzing the chemical composition of a wine. We could also ask people what they taste. So we could try to map from the chemical makeup of the wine to those flowery terms found on wine bottles, in which the wine is reported to have a lingering palate of cherries and hints of roses, and you know the language wine people use. In this case, that mapping would be very poor. You would not get a robust mapping between your analysis of the chemicals and the words people use, because our words for describing scents and tastes, aromas, are very undisciplined, shall we say. They're very rich, florid, we've got a large vocabulary there, but it's not really suited to quantitative measurement, whereas saying that one sound is higher or lower than another is a fairly minimal sort of discrimination where it comes easy to us. We could do this in touch. We can measure the pressure we apply to a part of the body. We could ask someone, how strong is that? Is this stronger? Is this weaker? Are these two applications of pressure similar? And so on. So we can do this in very, very many ways. In each case, psychophysics has the psycho bit, which is the perceptual experience when we ask you, what did this mean to you? And the physical bit where we have a measurement, and psychophysics tries to bridge the two. In a funny kind of way, this looks a little bit like the science of Cartesian dualism, doesn't it? Res extensa, the measurable properties, and res cogitans, the perceived properties. So although it's a little difficult to know quite what's going on here from a philosophical point of view, this psychophysical approach lends itself to the robust development of methods with results that can be repeated across laboratories, and sheds great light on the role of the senses in generating human experience.